I am going to introduce you to literally every person who has ever been a part of the United States Congress. Between his business acumen and his father dying from an infected wound and leaving him a large inheritance, Morris was quite successful. Lead resolution. The 38-year-old merchant and former sea captain. Hey, old Crazy Eyes is back. President pro tempore would have to be in charge, and that person was? Well, shit. How many senators were on time? No quorum! Oh boy. That can't be good. William Grayson of Virginia didn't show up at all. Of course, he was dead, so I guess that's a valid excuse. And I am not about to dig into it. Why do we even have a constitution? It started on... Oh, what the... God damn it.
June 8th, 1795, Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Not the first day of the first session of the Fourth Congress, but rather the first day of a special session of just the Senate, called by President Washington. As a quick refresher, each new Congress officially starts March 4th of the odd-numbered years, but the first actual legislative session doesn't start until the first Monday in December, or whatever other day they might choose. It's been all over the map so far. We've had sessions start in October, November, December, and even January. But if the president has urgent business while Congress is in recess, then he can call for a special session. This can be the whole Congress, or just the Senate, or just the House. In both the second and third Congresses, there was a one-day special session on March 4th, but this is the first one to take place this far into the recess. And Washington did have an urgent reason for calling this special session, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. So, June 8th, 1795, Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the first day of a special session of the Fourth United States Senate. We've got 15 states, so we're expecting 30 senators. So let's play another exciting round of How Many Senators Were on Time? The answer this time around is 24, which is our best first day attendance yet. Before we meet the senators, we have something brand new to the series. Official political parties. Yay! It's the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. Okay, so let's meet the 24 senators who were there on time on June 8th. From New Hampshire, Samuel Livermore and John Langdon. Both of these guys should be familiar to you at this point. John Langdon has been in the Senate since the beginning. Literally, he was there on March 4th, 1789, one of the 8 senators who showed up on time. In fact, he's been on time to all 10 sessions of the Senate so far. He was also named president pro tempore twice. He was also just re-elected, so he's starting a new 6-year term. Samuel Livermore joined the Senate in 1793 when he defeated the incumbent Payne Wingate, but he's been in Congress since the beginning. He was a representative for the first and second Congresses, and his attendance was almost as good as Langdon's. He's been on time to every session of Congress except for the very first one, when he was 2 months late. As for their political parties, well, we're already split. Langdon is a Democratic Republican and Livermore is a Federalist. From Massachusetts, Caleb Strong and George Cabot. Caleb Strong is another one of the original 8 senators that were on time to the first Congress. He was re-elected in 1793, so he's in the middle of his 6-year term. As for George Cabot, he started his term in 1791 when he defeated a crowded field to replace incumbent Tristram Dalton, so he is entering the final 2 years of his term. From Vermont, Moses Robinson. Vermont didn't become a state until 1791, but when it did, Moses Robinson was elected one of its first 2 senators. His seat was assigned to Class 1, meaning he was given a full 6-year term, so he's entering the final 2 years now. From Connecticut, Oliver Ellsworth and Jonathan Trumbull Jr. Ellsworth is another one of the original 8 that were on time to the first Congress. So out of that group of 8, 3 of them are still around now and still showing up on time. Good job, fellas. Ellsworth was re-elected right away heading into the second Congress in 1791, so he's entering the final 2 years of his term now. As for Jonathan Trumbull, he's new to the Senate, replacing the retired Stephen Mix Mitchell. But like Samuel Livermore a minute ago, Trumbull has been in Congress since the beginning, serving as a representative in the first 3. He was even elected Speaker of the House in the second Congress. From Rhode Island, Theodore Foster and William Bradford. Like Moses Robinson, Theodore Foster, aka Old Crazy Eyes, is as much of an original senator as he can be. Rhode Island didn't ratify the Constitution until 1790, but when it did, Foster was elected one of its first senators. He was given the short term, meaning he had to be re-elected right away heading into the second Congress, which he was. So he is entering the final 2 years of his term now. As for William Bradford, he joined the Senate in 1793, succeeding Joseph Stanton Jr. At 65 years old, Bradford is the oldest member of the Fourth Senate. And after the drama in the last episode with Roger Sherman, Abraham Clark, and Artemus Ward, you'll be relieved to learn that Bradford is going to survive this entire 2 years. From New York, Rufus King and Aaron Burr. Rufus King has been in the Senate since the beginning. Sort of. New York was a state, but its legislature didn't elect senators until after the first Congress started. But when they finally did, King was one of them. He was also just re-elected coming into this Congress, defeating future Representative Thomas Tillotson and former Representative John Lawrence. Although Wikipedia links to this John Lawrence, but I don't think a former mayor who died in 1699 was running in this election. As for Aaron Burr, he joined the Senate in 1791, defeating incumbent Philip Schuyler, so he is entering the final 2 years of his term. For more information about him, check out my Aaron Burr video after this one. From New Jersey, John Rutherford. Rutherford joined the Senate in 1791, succeeding Jonathan Elmer. And yes, I'm still bothered by the spelling of Rutherford's name. Here's a fun fact. The city in New Jersey, the place where the Giants and Jets play, was named after this guy, but they spelled it correctly. There's no concrete official reason for the change, but it's likely due to the fact that it was the late 1870s and Rutherford B. Hayes was president, so that spelling was way more common, and so that's the spelling they went with. From Pennsylvania, James Ross and William Bingham. This is our newest pair of senators. James Ross was specially elected during the Third Congress to replace Albert Gallatin. This is a Class 1 seat, so he'll be facing re-election at the end of this Congress. As for William Bingham, he is our first brand new guy. He defeated Representative Peter Muhlenberg to succeed the retired Robert Morris. Bingham is a 43-year-old merchant from Philadelphia. He was a delegate to the Continental Congress, a member of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, and most recently, a member of the Pennsylvania State Senate. From Delaware, Henry Latimer. As you'll recall from the last 2 episodes, Henry Latimer was a representative who was specially elected, eventually, to replace George Reed in the Senate 2 years after Reed had resigned. Latimer just joined the Senate in February of 1795, less than a month before the end of the Third Congress, but it was a Class 1 seat, meaning Latimer's term will end at the end of this Congress in 1797. From Maryland, Richard Potts. Potts joined the Senate late in the Second Congress when he was specially elected to replace Charles Carroll in January of 1793. This was also a Class 1 seat, meaning that, like Henry Latimer, Richard Potts will also be up for re-election at the end of this Congress. From Virginia, Henry Tazewell and Stevens T. Mason. Now this one's goofy. Both men were specially elected on November 18, 1794. Tazewell to replace John Taylor, who had resigned in May, and Mason to replace James Monroe, who had also resigned in May. However, only Henry Tazewell joined during the Third Congress. To explain.
And that brings us to March 3rd, 1795, the end of the Third Congress. And wait. There's still a vacancy. Yes, it seems that Stevens T. Mason never arrived. He had been elected at the same time as Henry Tazewell back in November of 1794, but while Tazewell arrived on December 29th, Mason just never showed up. Or, if he did, then A, the Journal of the Senate forgot to record it, which would be really unusual, and 2, he didn't participate in a single vote, which would be extremely unlikely. The next Congress starts with another special session, this time in June, and Mason is there for that. So my theory is that he just had too much going on to, just up and leave right away, and so he didn't get to Philadelphia until after March 3rd. I like to picture him arriving on March 4th, and it going something like this.
I'm here.
God damn it!
Stevens T. Mason is a 34-year-old lawyer from Stafford County, Virginia. He was a member of both the Virginia House of Delegates and the Virginia State Senate. From Kentucky, John Brown and Humphrey Marshall. Brown is another original congressman combining his time in the House and Senate. He was one of Virginia's first representatives, although he arrived 3.5 months late, and then his district ceased to exist when Kentucky split off and became its own state. Instead of running to be one of Kentucky's first representatives, he was instead elected to be one of its first senators. Humphrey Marshall, on the other hand, is another brand new guy. He defeated John Brown's cousin, a future senator called John Breckinridge, not to be confused with his grandson, John C. Breckinridge, another future senator who later became vice president under James Buchanan. But anyway, back to Humphrey Marshall. He is a 34 or 35-year-old farmer and surveyor turned lawyer from Orleans, Virginia, and he's coming off of 2 years in the Kentucky House of Representatives. He's also a cousin and brother-in-law of Chief Justice John Marshall. Yes, cousin and brother-in-law. Try not to think about it too hard. Let's just move on. From North Carolina, Alexander Martin and Timothy Bloodworth. Martin joined the Senate back in 1793, defeating a very crowded field to succeed incumbent Samuel Johnston. It was the second time Martin succeeded Johnston, having previously followed him as governor of North Carolina after Johnston left that job to join the First Senate. As for Timothy Bloodworth, fantastic name by the way, he is new to the Senate, but not to Congress. He was one of North Carolina's first representatives back in 1790, but then lost his bid for re-election to William Barry Grove. While he was away from Congress, he served in North Carolina's House of Representatives. He also defeated a very crowded field to succeed the retired Benjamin Hawkins. From South Carolina, Jacob Reed, another brand new guy. Reed is a 42 or 43-year-old lawyer from Charleston. Before Congress, he fought in the Revolutionary War, during which he was a prisoner for a while. After the war, he was a member of the Continental Congress and the South Carolina House of Representatives. In that state legislature, he was Speaker of the House for the last 5 years. In the election coming into this Congress, Reed defeated Representative John Hunter to succeed the retired Ralph Izard. And finally, our last on-time senator, from Georgia, James Jackson. He was one of Georgia's original representatives back in the first Congress. Then he lost his re-election bid for the second Congress to Anthony Wayne. He challenged the result and took his case to the House. He succeeded in getting them to declare the election void, and Wayne was removed. But instead of giving the seat to Jackson, the House just made Georgia hold a special election. By the time that election rolled around, Jackson had set his sights on something else: the Senate. And in 1793, he won that election instead, defeating the incumbent William Few and Representative George Matthews. So that was the opening day lineup, so to speak. The remaining 6 members of the roster arrived soon after. On June 9th, they were joined by Frederick Frelinghuysen of New Jersey, James Gunn of Georgia, and Pierce Butler of South Carolina. All 3 of these guys are incumbents. Frelinghuysen joined in 1793, succeeding the retired Philemon Dickinson, and Gunn and Butler are original senators. Not part of the original 8 that were on time to the first Congress, though. They were anything but. Gunn was a month and a half late, and Butler was 3 months late. Both guys have also been re-elected since then. Butler defeated a crowded field heading into the 3rd Congress, so he's in the middle of his term, and Gunn defeated a less crowded field coming into this Congress, so he's starting a new 6-year term. On June 12th, John Henry of Maryland arrived. Like James Gunn and Pierce Butler, John Henry was another original senator, but not part of the original 8. In fact, he and James Gunn both first arrived on the same day, April 20th, 1789. Also like James Gunn, John Henry was re-elected coming into this Congress, so he too is starting a new 6-year term. On June 13th, a brand new guy arrived: Elijah Payne of Vermont. Payne is a 38-year-old lawyer who was originally from Brooklyn, Connecticut, but moved to Windsor, Vermont in 1784 to set up his law practice. Before Congress, he was a state representative, a probate court judge, and a justice on the Vermont Supreme Court. Payne defeated the incumbent Stephen R. Bradley. And finally, on June 15, 1795, Senator number 30 arrived: Delaware's John Vining. Vining has been in Congress since the beginning, serving as Delaware's only representative in the first 2 Congresses. However, that statement does come with an asterisk. While he was a representative, Vining was elected to a term in the Delaware State Senate. Vining chose to do that instead, but he never resigned, so his term continued until it ended naturally at the close of the Second Congress in 1793, by which time he had been elected back to Congress to succeed Richard Bassett in the Senate. He is in the middle of his 6-year term. June 24th, 1795. Now, I know this isn't a deep dive series, the point of this is just to meet every member of Congress ever, but I should at least tell you why President Washington called this special session in the first place, because it is relevant. The year before, Washington had sent Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate a treaty with the British. I won't bore you with the complicated backstory, but the long and short of it is that Britain and France were engaging in their favorite pastime, war with each other, and there was some lingering tensions between America and Britain related to unresolved issues since the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that officially ended the Revolutionary War. Washington wanted to resolve those issues so that the two nations could continue trading with each other without America getting sucked into the European War. John Jay returned with a signed treaty, which is officially called the Treaty of Amity, Commerce, and Navigation between His Britannic Majesty and the United States of America. Understandably, it's known much more simply as the Jay Treaty. Constitutionally, treaties need to be ratified by the Senate, and so Washington called for the special session. But it wasn't an easy process. While the treaty eased tensions with Britain, it inflamed them between Americans. Again, it's long and complicated, and I don't have time in this video to explain it properly, but very basically, the Federalists supported it, and the Democratic Republicans hated it. And I mean hated it. The existing divide between the two factions was solidified, and the factions became official political parties, meaning they started to actually coordinate their actions and strategies across various regions in support of or to attack the treaty. So, the Jay Treaty and the debate surrounding it was the final step in the process of creating the official political party system that we know and hate today. That's why it's relevant to this series. And so, June 24th, 1795, the Jay Treaty is ratified by a party line vote of 20-10. June 26th, 1795, the last day of the special session. All 30 senators have appeared. We've got 7 new guys, 5 brand new, plus 2 former representatives. And on the other end of the spectrum, we've got 7 original senators. That's a nice balance. Unfortunately, the next 2 years are not going to go smoothly. No one's gonna die, so there's that. But a lot of guys are going to resign. And the first one happened right away. At some point between the end of the special session and the beginning of the first session, James Jackson of Georgia resigned. We may not know the exact date he resigned, but we do know the exact reason why. The Yazoo land scandal. Okay, bear with me here. The state of Georgia didn't look like this back then. A couple episodes back, I said it looked like this, but that wasn't entirely accurate. I mean, it was in the sense that this is what the settled area was, the area that was counted for the purposes of congressional apportionment. But in terms of what Georgia claimed as its boundaries, well, it actually looked like this. Now, most of that western land, what is today the upper 2/3 of Mississippi and Alabama, was settled by various Native American tribes, one of which was the Yazoo, who had long since been driven out by a combination of other tribes and French settlers in the mid-1700s. But while they were there, a river was named after them. This Yazoo River then became the namesake for the land surrounding it. So, when Georgia claimed all that western land, the whole area became known as the Yazoo lands. Still with me? Okay. So, Georgia claimed all this land, but after the Revolutionary War, they needed money, and they also didn't really have the resources to defend and maintain all that area. So they were open to the idea of selling it. A few attempts were made in the 1780s, but none of them panned out. Separate from all that, a bunch of rich dudes who were into land speculation, including Senator James Gunn and Supreme Court Justice James Wilson, had formed some land companies. In 1794, these companies came together and approached the Georgia legislature to express interest in purchasing the Yazoo lands. In January of 1795, Georgia Governor George Matthews officially authorized the sale of 35 million acres for $500,000, or about 1.4 cents per acre. Not only was this a suspiciously low amount, but it soon came out that the land companies had made sweet insider deals with all kinds of influential Georgians, including state and local legislators, to help secure passage of the sale. The companies were giving these guys deals on huge plots of land for low prices, but still making a hell of a profit themselves on account of the sweet deal they got from those very same legislators. When all this came out, the people of Georgia were pissed. And so, this brings us back to James Jackson. Like the people of Georgia, Jackson was pissed about the bribery and corruption involved, so he resigned from the Senate in order to return to Georgia and lead the fight against the sale. And lead the fight he did. He used newspapers to drum up and maintain support, and he campaigned throughout the state for various Democratic-Republican candidates. Within a year, he had gotten enough of them elected to the state assembly to flip it from Federalist to Democratic-Republican control. His Democratic-Republican candidate for governor, Jared Irwin, defeated the Federalist George Matthews, and almost immediately, Irwin officially repealed the Yazoo land sale with the Rescinding Act of 1796. James Jackson had won. The actual fallout from the Yazoo sale and its repeal would take a couple decades to sort out, but for our purposes, it was over, and Jackson had won. Not only had he defeated the Yazoo sale, but he had built up Georgia's Democratic-Republican Party to near total dominance. He would himself be elected governor the next year in 1797. December 7th, 1795, Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the first day of the first session of the Fourth United States Congress. Our first day attendance dropped off from the special session. Only 18 senators were present this time.
Ooh, that's bad.
One of them was New Hampshire's John Langdon, though, so his on-time streak is up to 11 sessions.
That's good.
But Vice President John Adams was also missing.
Ooh, that's bad.
So Virginia's Henry Tazewell was elected president pro tempore. That's bad.
Can I go now?
On December 18th, 1795, George Walton arrived from Georgia. Back in November, Federalist Governor George Matthews had appointed Walton to temporarily replace James Jackson. Walton is a lawyer who's 45 or 46 years old, or 54 or 55. Or as young as 44. Different sources have wildly different birth years. Anyway, Walton is a former Continental Congressman, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and a former governor of Georgia. He's also originally from Cumberland County, Virginia, so we'll add him to the list of people representing Georgia who weren't born in Georgia. Walton is a Federalist replacing a Democratic-Republican, increasing their majority to 21-9, but don't get too attached. He's only going to be here until the Georgia state legislature gets together and elects a new senator. And when that happens, James Jackson's Democratic-Republican candidates will have taken control, so they'll be electing a Democratic-Republican senator. On March 8, 1796, Connecticut's Oliver Ellsworth resigned. He had a pretty good reason. President Washington nominated him to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Washington had originally appointed a man called John Rutledge the previous summer to replace John Jay. Rutledge was what's called a recess appointment, meaning the president made the appointment while Congress was in recess. This means that the person starts the job right away, and then the Senate confirms or rejects them at the next session. The majority of the time, it's a routine confirmation. But when the first session of this Congress started in December, one of their first orders of business was to reject Rutledge, leaving him with the record, which still stands today, of shortest term as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So Washington turned to Ellsworth, who was confirmed almost unanimously. The lone vote against him was from Stevens T. Mason. On April 12th, Josiah Tatnall arrived from Georgia to replace the interim appointee George Walton. Tatnall is a 33 or 34-year-old state representative from, holy shit, Savannah, Georgia. Tatnall didn't get into politics until 1795, when he was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives. When Jackson resigned his Senate seat so that he could return to Georgia and fight against the Yazoo land sale, Josiah Tatnall fought alongside Jackson. They won, and the legislature passed the Rescinding Act of 1796, and afterwards the legislature elected Tatnall to be Jackson's replacement in the Senate. On May 23rd, Rufus King of New York resigned. He had a pretty good reason. President Washington had nominated him to replace Thomas Pinckney as Minister to Great Britain. The year before, Washington had nominated him to be Secretary of State, but King declined. This time he said yes, probably because George Washington wasn't the sort of guy you said no to twice. The first session ended on June 1st, 1796, but not without some drama. First, President Washington signed into law the act officially admitting Tennessee into the Union as the 16th state. The Tennessee legislature had already elected the state's first two senators, and both men had arrived in Philadelphia over a week ago. The Senate had narrowly voted to allow them to sit in as spectators until the whole statehood issue was ironed out. When it was finally done and Tennessee officially became a state on June 1st, the two senators-elect presented their credentials so that they could be sworn into the Senate. By one vote, the Senate said no. no. Vermont's Moses Robinson could have told them that was going to happen. The Senate refused to admit Tennessee's senators because Tennessee wasn't a state when they were elected, so they came all the way up to Philadelphia for nothing. One of them may have been a little bitter about that. Also on June 1st, Caleb Strong of Massachusetts resigned. His intention was to retire to private life, so he had probably made his decision weeks or even months ago, but he at least stuck around until the end of the current session. Sort of. He was there during the day to vote on a bill about embargoes, but when the Senate reconvened later that night to vote on whether or not to allow Tennessee's senators to join, Strong was absent. The Senate adjourned until December, and over the course of the 6-month recess, 7 more senators resigned. The first one, on June 10th, was Jonathan Trumbull Jr. of Connecticut. He had been elected lieutenant governor. Then, on June 11th, the Massachusetts legislature held a pair of elections. First, they elected a replacement for Caleb Strong. Then, they elected a successor to George Cabot, who was not running for re-election. After Cabot's friend Benjamin Goodhue was elected, Cabot decided not to finish his term and resigned. So the Massachusetts legislature went ahead and held a third election, appointing Goodhue as Cabot's replacement as well as his successor. On August 2nd, Tennessee re-elected their first 2 senators, similar to what Vermont had done with Stephen R. Bradley and Moses Robinson back in 1791. And hey, speaking of Moses Robinson, in October, Moses Robinson resigned. His resignation is dated the 15th, and Vermont held their elections for the next Congress on the 18th. So I think his resignation is just like Cabot's, in the sense that Robinson decided to resign based on the election result. However, there's a twist. In the case of Cabot, he wasn't running and his friend had been elected, so Cabot decided to quit early, knowing the job was in good hands, so to speak. But in Robinson's case, the election data is lost, so we don't know if he was running or not. But we do know that Robinson is a Democratic Republican, and the winner of the election, Isaac Tickner, is a Federalist. My theory is that Robinson was indeed running and lost, and decided to resign rather than finish his term. It seems petty, and it kind of is, but it's also a very common reason for resignations, for both the Senate and the House. The next resignation was Maryland's Richard Potts on October 24th. Now, we don't have to speculate in his case. He took a job as Chief Justice of Maryland's 5th Judicial Circuit Court. And on November 12th, New Jersey's Frederick Frelinghuysen resigned. This is another one that we don't have a reason for, so we'll default to retired to private life. December 5th, 1796, Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the first day of the second session of the 4th United States Senate. And only 16 senators were there. Now that there were 16 states, that meant there were 32 expected senators, so they were 1 short of a quorum. December 6th, 1796, Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the second day of the second session of the 4th United States Senate. 2 more guys arrived, so the Senate can now officially get underway. And for their first order of business, Vice President John Adams read a letter of resignation from South Carolina Senator Pierce Butler. Butler retired to private life or something. Who cares? Good riddance, etc. I'm just glad to be done with him. Among the 18 senators present, we've got 6 guys who were elected to fill some of the various vacancies. John Lawrence of New York was elected in November to replace Rufus King, who was one of the earlier resignations all the way back in May. Lawrence had been one of New York's first representatives, serving in the House from 1789 to 1793 when he chose not to run for re-election. While he was away from Congress, President Washington appointed him to a job as district court judge in New York. James Hillhouse and Uriah Tracy of Connecticut were elected to replace Oliver Ellsworth and Jonathan Trumbull Jr., respectively. They are both incumbent representatives. What's weird is that Hillhouse had been elected all the way back in May while Congress was still in session. So I would have thought that once he got the news that he had been elected to the Senate, he would just say goodbye to the House and then go upstairs and join the Senate, like Henry Latimer of Delaware did in the last Congress. But I would be wrong. On May 16th, he was granted leave from the House for the remainder of the session, but instead of joining the Senate, he just went home until the second session started. Benjamin Goodhue of Massachusetts is another incumbent representative, and he's been in the House since the very beginning. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, Goodhue was elected first to succeed George Cabot when his term ended, and then Cabot resigned, so Goodhue was immediately elected to replace him. The other 2 new arrivals are brand new guys. First, from New Jersey, Richard Stockton was elected to replace Frederick Frelinghuysen. Stockton is a lawyer from Princeton. His father, also called Richard Stockton, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and his uncle is former Representative Elias Boudinot. Before Congress, Stockton was New Jersey's district attorney from 1789 to 1791, and at 32 years old, he is the youngest member of this Senate. The other new guy is Isaac Ticknor of Vermont, who was elected first to succeed Moses Robinson and then to replace him after he resigned. Ticknor is a 42-year-old lawyer and judge who was originally from Newark, New Jersey, then spent a couple years studying law in Schenectady, New York, and finally settled in Bennington, Vermont during the war. He was a member of the Vermont House of Representatives, during which he was Speaker of the House for 2 years. After that, he was sent to the Continental Congress, not as a delegate, but as an agent, representing Vermont and petitioning Congress to admit Vermont as a state. You may recall from a couple episodes back that the issue with Vermont's statehood was that New York claimed Vermont as part of its territory, and Congress, both the continental version and the post-1789 constitutional version, couldn't make Vermont a state until that was settled. So, Vermont and New York each sent a delegation to determine an official boundary line. Isaac Ticknor was part of that delegation. After all that, he unsuccessfully ran for Congress in 1791, then joined the Vermont State Supreme Court, where he served until his election to the Senate. We also have Tennessee's first two senators, William Blount and William Koch. Blount is a 47-year-old land speculator from Bertie County with a long history in politics. He was a member of the North Carolina House of Commons, the Continental Congress, and the North Carolina State Senate, as well as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. More recently, he was governor of the Southwest Territory from 1790 until it became the state of Tennessee in 1796. As for Koch, he is a 47 or 48-year-old lawyer originally from Amelia County, Virginia. Before he moved to the Southwest Territory, Koch briefly served in the Virginia House of Burgesses. After moving to the Southwest Territory in 1777, Koch joined up with John Sevier in that whole State of Franklin adventure. Koch was even elected to represent Franklin in the Continental Congress if it became a state, but alas, it did not. He stayed off the radar for a while after that, until reappearing as a delegate to Tennessee's State Constitutional Convention in 1796, and now, finally, as one of Tennessee's first senators. On December 21st, Theodore Sedgwick of Massachusetts arrived. He is another guy who's new to the Senate, but he's been in Congress since the beginning, serving as one of Massachusetts' representatives since 1789. He was elected to replace Caleb Strong. On December 27th, another brand new guy arrived. 44-year-old John Eager Howard of Maryland. After fighting in the Revolutionary War, Howard was a member of the Continental Congress, then governor of Maryland, then a Maryland state senator. He had been elected to replace Richard Potts back on November 28th, and by the time he arrived in Philadelphia, he had also already been elected to the next term as well. And finally, on January 27, 1797, John Hunter of South Carolina arrived, replacing Pierce Butler. Hunter was a former congressman. He had been one of South Carolina's representatives in the 3rd Congress, but lost his bid for re-election to Robert Goodloe Harper. The 4th Congress ended March 3rd, 1797, and that means we've made it through another round of senators. So, let's update some numbers. In the end, the 4th Senate had 32 seats held by 43 senators. 20 of them were new to the Senate. So we've now met a total of 70 senators and 214 congressmen overall. As for deaths and resignations, the 4th Senate had 0 deaths, which is the last time you're going to hear me say that for a while. On the flip side, there were 10 resignations, which is a lot. So for just the Senate, we're still at 2 deaths, but we're up to 17 resignations. For Congress overall, we're at 5 deaths and 22 resignations. And so, with the numbers updated, that means it's re-election time once again. But first, let's deal with the 11 guys who left early. 3 of them will return to the Senate and this series in the future. James Jackson of Georgia will be back in 1801. Pierce Butler of South Carolina will unfortunately be back in 1802. And Rufus King of New York will be back in 1813. For the remaining 8, it's goodbye forever. George Walton of Georgia had been a temporary replacement for James Jackson, appointed by Governor Governor Matthews to serve until a proper successor could be elected. When that successor arrived, Walton retired to private life in Augusta, where he eventually died on February 2, 1804, at the age of 54 or 55, or 53, or 60. Who knows? Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut resigned to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In 1799, while he was still Chief Justice, President Adams made him envoy extraordinary to the court of France. He did succeed in helping end the quasi-war with the Treaty of Mortefontaine, but his travel across the Atlantic also exacerbated his existing health issues. He resigned from the Supreme Court while he was in France. After returning to America in 1801, he served on the Connecticut Governor's Council until his death in Windsor on November 26, 1807. The town of Ellsworth, Maine is named after him. His son, William Wolcott Ellsworth, and his son-in-law, Thomas Scott Williams, both became representatives from Connecticut. Caleb Strong of Massachusetts resigned to retire to private life, but after a few years, the Federalists pulled him out of retirement and made him run for governor of Massachusetts. You may remember this fun
He
bit.
officially aligned himself with the Democratic-Republican Party in 1800, and that's when he started running for governor of Massachusetts again. Repeatedly. He ran in 1800 and lost to Caleb Strong. He ran in 1801 and lost to Caleb Strong. He ran in 1802 and lost to Caleb Strong. He ran in 1803 and lost to Caleb Strong. I guess Caleb's candidacy was just too strong.
Strong served several terms as governor from 1800 to 1807 and then again from 1812 to 1816. After that, he was finally allowed to retire for real. He died in Northampton on November 7, 1819. George Cabot of Massachusetts also resigned to retire to private life, and he was much more successful than Caleb Strong. He briefly emerged in 1814 to attend the Hartford Convention, where he served as its president, but then retired again. He died in Boston on April 18, 1823. His great-grandson, Henry Cabot Lodge, became both a representative and a longtime senator. Lodge also wrote a biography of George Cabot in 1877. And Cabot's great-great-great-grandson, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., became a senator. Jonathan Trumbull Jr. of Connecticut resigned after being elected lieutenant governor. He did that for a year until the governor, Oliver Wolcott, died in office. So Trumbull became governor and was re-elected every year until he himself died in office on August 7, 1809 in Lebanon, Connecticut. Trumbull had no direct congressional descendants, but he did have a nephew, Joseph Trumbull, who became a representative from Connecticut. Moses Robinson of Vermont resigned to retire to private life. He did come out of retirement for one term in the Vermont House of Representatives, but besides that, he stuck to farming and land speculation. He died in Bennington on May 26, 1813. His brother Jonathan Robinson later became a senator. Richard Potts of Maryland also resigned to retire to private life, and like the others, he also only stayed retired for a few years. He served as a judge on the Maryland Court of Appeals from 1801 to 1806. He died in Frederick on November 26, 1808. And finally, Frederick Frelinghuysen of New Jersey resigned to, say it with me now, retire to private life, but after a few years went back into politics. He served in the New Jersey General Assembly, and he was also a state attorney. He died in Millstone on his 51st birthday, April 13, 1804. As for congressional descendants, well, Frelinghuysen holds the record so far. His son, Theodore Frelinghuysen, was a senator and also the Whig candidate for vice president in 1844 on the ticket with Henry Clay. His grandson, Frederick Theodore Frelinghuysen, was a senator and also Secretary of State under President Arthur. His great-grandson, Joseph Sherman Frelinghuysen, was a senator. His great-great-great-grandson, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., oh, hey, him again, was a senator. Another great-great-great-grandson, John Davis Lodge, started off as an actor before eventually becoming a representative, and also an ambassador to Spain, Argentina, and Switzerland. Another great-great-great-grandson, Peter Hood Ballantine Frelinghuysen Jr., was a longtime representative. And last but not least, his great-great-great-great-grandson, Rodney Frelinghuysen, was a longtime representative. Altogether, this bloodline has been represented in in Congress for 83 of its 234 years, or roughly 35% of Congress's entire existence. Moving on to the elections, 11 senators are at the end of their terms. Of these, 9 were re-elected. Congratulations to those 9 guys. Of the remaining 2, only one of them actually lost their election, Aaron Burr of New York, who was defeated by Philip Schuyler, the man Burr defeated back in 1791. As for what happened to Burr after Congress, the whole story is in this other video I did. It's pretty good, you should check it out. And that leaves us with William Koch of Tennessee. He didn't lose his election because there simply wasn't one. Similar to Pennsylvania a couple episodes back, the Tennessee state legislature failed to elect a senator to the next Congress, leaving the seat vacant. Eventually, in April of 1797, the governor, John Sevier, a former representative from all the way back in the first episode, appointed him to fill the vacancy, but that's all in the 5th Congress, so we'll deal with that in the next episode. Thank you so much for watching. I am the Congressman, and I will see you next time.